thanks for the intro. So my name is Ben Cooper, and my current role is general manager of a tree company here in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota. We're probably the largest one. We have about 150 employees, and all we do is focus in on tree preservation, and a big part of that is the pruning of trees. So I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you guys a little bit more about proper tree pruning, which is a passion of mine. So Connie had said I went to the University of Minnesota. I've been an arborist now since 2000. So my God, going on my 23rd year here as an arborist. Got my start wielding a chainsaw. After college, I climbed trees, moved out to Pacific Northwest to get out of the Midwest for a bit and climbed trees in Portland for a small tree company out there. Was out there for about 4 years and came back and actually started here at Rainbow 20 years ago. This is my 20th anniversary. But just really love this company that I found. It's a great organization with a great mission. Like Connie had said, we actually started this other nonprofit called Saluting Branches. And 2 years ago, we actually became an employee-owned company. So we're officially an ESOP company, which is just great. It gives back to everyone in the organization. So yeah, so excited to be here, everybody. Okay, good. I was just reading the the notes there. So it sounds like some might be having a little trouble with sound, but I'm going to share my screen so we can get into the conversation here. And I got to share it the appropriate way. There we go. Connie, I can see your face. Does that look good? You can see that all right?
Yeah,
All
I
right.
see it. Mm-hmm.
And I guess as we go along, there's quite a few people, but I guess I would encourage people to, if you know how to do the hand raise, you could raise your hand or just say, hey, Ben, I got a question. Either way would be fine. And I guess we'll just manage it that way. And if it's too much, we can hold off on questions till the end. But tonight's topic is proper pruning for trees. So I am going to give you the basics of the do's and the don'ts and the whys and the hows of proper tree pruning. Give me a sec. So, oops. Back one slide here. Need to move this toolbar out of the way. Give me a sec. I think I'd have this down by now. There we go. Okay. So starting at the top. So why would I even be concerned about pruning a tree? I mean, obviously limbs hitting houses, things like that are pretty common. But really there's three major reasons that we think about maintaining and pruning trees. So the first one is really maintenance. So the health and appearance of the tree, removal of dead wood and diseased material. So it's really this maintenance aspect of pruning. Second is really from a training standpoint. So training young trees to establish good structure. Now, this is something that is a little bit newer, maybe in urban forestry, where there's a much bigger focus on taking care of trees when they're young and pruning them appropriately so that they do fit the environment in the long run. I mean, if we're planting trees in boulevards, we have garbage trucks and buses and all sorts of equipment to have to deal with. So we need to train those trees when they're young to be able to sustain themselves when they're older in an urban setting. And then the last reason is safety. So making sure that trees have the appropriate structure and making sure that they are safe, that there's no big dead wood hanging out in those, in the branches that are over a structure or over a parking lot or something like that. So it's really to focus in on hazard reduction. So we've got maintenance, we've got young tree training, and we've got safety. Those are the three primary reasons that we prune trees. So maybe to start, really to start on what is a tree even doing? Like what is the setup that we're talking about here when we start to think about tree pruning? So we need to remember that trees are energy capturing systems. The whole purpose of these canopies with these leaves that they create, it's pretty incredible. Year in and year out, are all there in order to collect energy for this incredible plant that we call the tree. So the leaves are like the solar panels that are out on these branches. And really, it's important to remember that each branch really has its own, it's autonomous. So it's like its own anatomy. So each limb, whether it's a deciduous tree or a conifer, is its own autonomous system. So that's why you'll see branches start to die off as they're maybe being an energy sink instead of creating energy for the tree, and that's a reason that branches start to die off. So each of them is set up as their own individual system. Energy storage changes with the season. So I've got a slide that's going to show briefly kind of what happens when we get seasonal changes, what happens to the trees. And then we're going to get to talking about pruning. So trees are really actually incredibly sophisticated when it comes to how they deal with decay within their systems. So they have what's called a branch collar. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. So as I said, leaves, very similar, to a solar panel on a house. So there are a lot of people now that are adopting solar energy, but same concept. This plant, each one of those leaves is feeding this tree, pulling in energy, converting energy from sun energy into starch that is something that the tree can actually use to grow and develop. So again, like I said, each branch is autonomous. They all function like a separate tree. And oftentimes the reason that we start to see dead branches in trees is because those branches were no longer supporting that tree. They were actually, it was taking more energy to support that branch than the tree was giving back. And so it became a carbon sink. And that's why branches often die out. And you can see that again in your yard in an urban setting, or you can see it in a forest. Maybe if there's a pine plantation or a bunch of trees in the forest that are growing close together, as there's less sunlight available, those branches start to die off because they just can't sustain themselves, within that plant. And this is just an example where we were showing the starch that's moving up and down this plant system. I think these were a couple of cottonwood limbs, if I recall, but we added some dye to give, really show the energy that's being captured inside those limbs, moving down to the roots. And here's where I was sharing. It's interesting to understand the times at which trees might be the most at risk. And really it's in the spring season. So if you look at this, kind of a basic graph, we've got the months down at the bottom, and then the energy reserves on the other axis. And it shows sort of the different stages throughout the growing season. Obviously, September in our Midwest environment is where leaves drop off, and all of the energy that was in those leaves is stored down into the roots, and it's held there. It's held in the trunk and it's held in the roots over the course of the winter. And then when May comes around, April, May, June, depending on the species, those energy reserves that are in those roots are used to then generate leaves all over again each spring. So
Mhm.
it takes a tremendous amount of energy for a plant to push leaves out each year and also put on new tissue each year. And so that's just a really critical time in the tree's life, each annual cycle, when we go through that spring cycle. So it's actually in the world of pruning, if you can avoid, there's really very few times to avoid pruning trees. But during that critical time of leaf out from like bud break till complete leaf elongation, which can be 2 to 4 weeks depending on the species, that's a time to maybe leave a tree alone and not necessarily prune it. And another thing I would point out here too is that if we do get a frost, for example, a late frost after the trees have leafed out, the tree has to go through this whole cycle again. And so it's now doubling down on the amount of energy that it's taking to push out those leaves. So those can be, situations that trees get more stressed out. And as I said, we're going to talk about pruning. That's what this discussion is about. So trees have built-in protection systems called branch collars. And there's something, actually, I got a slide. I'll get to that. I won't jump ahead and jump ahead of myself. So here's an example of a branch on a tree, and it's really highlighting these protection systems, and I'll show you more about that. So here's a cross section of the inside of that same tree that we were just showing right here. So just cut longitudinally right down the trunk of the tree, bisecting those branches that were there, and it's showing what's going on inside of the tree. And you can see what I was referring to as the branch collar, which is an area that its whole intention is to be able to block out disease and decay getting into the trunk. And it does that by the tissue growing over the top of that wound. In this case, it's a limb. So while the limb's there, it's just there hanging out, just tissue. And if that limb happens to die, or it's removed and it's alive and it's removed, this branch collar, this differentiated material jumps into action and it closes off that wound as quickly as possible to avoid getting decay back into the main stem of the tree. So here it's showing where we would make a cut. If I had my handsaw, we always want to cut just outside of this tissue. So we don't want to damage this tissue, and this is really a critical detail of proper pruning is how to make, once we've decided which cuts we're going to make, which I'll go into, it's that we make these proper cuts. So very critical to stay away from that branch collar. You want to be as close as you can, but you don't want to cut it because that's that critical different material that's going to close up that wound so we keep decay out of the main trunk. So here's an example. I don't know how well you can see it. It's not the greatest photo, but you can see those are some decay fungi that are up on that kind of blackened spot on this tree trunk. These are poor cuts. They weren't made at that appropriate spot, like I was talking about at the branch collar. And on top of it, those wounds are probably they're painted. I know they were because I took the picture, but they're painted wounds. And a common question we get is, does wound dressing do anything for a tree? And it doesn't. Making the appropriate and proper cuts is really what keeps the decay out of the stem of trees. So that's the most important part. The one nuance I would say about not painting wounds, the only time that we do, and we don't actually paint them, we use spray shellac, which is just an impermeable you know, waterproofing for wood. But with oak wilt and Dutch elm disease, if we have to deal with trees during the growing season that might be infected by these particular diseases, we will close over those wounds. And I can talk more about that with you as we go on, but that would be the one nuance where we do paint wounds. All right, good pruning. So good pruning, some of the things that we talk about. Really minimize the removal of the living wood unless there's a specific reason to do it. And when we talk about young tree pruning, there's a very good reason to do it. And we'll talk more about that. But we're primarily focused on removal of dead tissue. There's kind of a joke that I guess amongst arborists is that customers oftentimes feel like they, the more volume that they see out there under their tree after it got pruned, the better deal they're getting. It's like this more is better. If we're not cutting enough, tissue off this tree, then I'm just not getting a good deal. And it's really quite the opposite. If you're doing good pruning, you may not see much. It may just be dead material that's getting taken out of the tree. If we are removing live tissue, we've got this rule of thumb that's 25%. So not removing any more than 25%. And in mature trees, it's typically much lower than that. But in young trees, you can get pretty aggressive. Some of the hybrid elms, for example, I swear you could prune those things twice a year and take out 50% of the canopy and they'd be just fine. They just grow like weeds. Another thing with good pruning, proper cuts at the branch collar. We talked about that. Not lion's tailing. So I'll show a photo of that, but that's removal of all of the interior tissue of a tree. It actually creates kind of the opposite effect of what people think they might be getting. No topping. So this used to be a much more common practice. It's starting to disappear for the most part by and large, but this is just indiscriminate removal of the tops of trees, thinking that it's supporting, not being as prone to wind damage, and actually it has the opposite effect. Not climbing with climbing spikes. So climbing, but there's ways that arborists can climb and move around in trees now that is really rock climbing, mountaineering. It's very similar to that. The only time that we use climbing spikes is if we're doing tree removal. And then the proper time of the year. And like I say, that's a pretty wide berth. There's a handful of species that we do need to be careful about. Oaks and elms primarily are the two big ones. And that's because of oak wilt and Dutch elm disease concerns. So the disease is vectored by an insect that is actually looking for these fresh wounds on these trees. And so you can be moving the disease around if you're pruning those trees in the summertime. And I'm sure most of you in Grant County are pretty familiar with oak wilt. It's a pretty common disease. So we want to stay away from pruning oaks during the growing season. So our rule of thumb is from April 1st until November 30th, we don't prune oaks. So we actually just save ours for the winter time, and then there's no risk of potential oak wilt. Let's talk a little bit about the tools. So, there are certainly professional tools. I was talking about, chainsaws and use of chainsaws and trees and, climbing systems and things like that. But I'm going to guess that most master gardeners are not going to be investing in any tree climbing gear anytime soon. So what you all would probably have are hand pruners. There are a lot of different types of hand pruners. And I actually talked about this last year when we went through shrub pruning. But I really prefer this bypass style. And that's what's in the photo. I think this is a Felco. The Felcos are pretty bomb proof. I think I've still got the same one that I got 25 years ago. And they make a really nice clean cut. they don't compress the tissue, and that's why I really like them. They just make a nice clean cut, so you don't have to worry about any more dead tissue, which is important. And then a good handsaw is always a great thing. And there's a lot of different types out there. The ones that the professionals have really gravitated towards is called Silky brand, and you can find those online by multiple distributors. And there's all sorts of different types. I got a little folding one like the one that's shown here. I've got one that fits in a scabbard that can go on my pant leg that I really like. The one thing I will caution: a good handsaw is a great tool, but a good handsaw is really sharp. So you can certainly do some damage with them. So respect them like you would a chainsaw. We actually, like with our new climbers, we always have to train on this because they just don't respect them, and we get cuts on legs and things like that. We have far more handsaw cuts than we've ever had chainsaw cuts within my business. So just a word of caution. But those are the tools. Another tool is a pole clipper. So you got a pole clipper on the right and a pole saw on the left. Now these are great tools. You keep in mind overhead power lines. You don't want to mess around with those with these tools. That always scares me a little bit. You don't want to be standing right underneath and take a limb, to the head. And you also need to know about making proper cuts, which we'll talk about, because these tools oftentimes lead to making poor cuts just because we're not aware, or we're taking maybe an easier route. There's some tools out there that have both a pole saw and a pole clip together. If you're going to use them with any frequency, I really prefer them to be separate. And you can even buy them where you buy a pole and they have removable heads, so you can actually swap back and forth. You'll see that quite a bit. So that could be useful. But I find it's really cumbersome to try and use the combination units. I think my dad has one that's a combination unit, and I just don't prefer them to be separate. But both great tools. And these also, sometimes come in like 8-foot lengths, but I've seen collapsible ones that, you might be able to get 20 or 24 feet out of. They're pretty incredible, but then you have to be able to stand on the ground and hold that thing and make a good cut. So, the 8 to 10 foot length is probably the easiest to use or the most effective to use. Oh, and I see some questions in the chat here too. Okay, so we'll talk more about the branch collar. That was one question. And then there was another question that said, isn't topping recommended for overgrown fruit trees? So that is actually one exception. But if you're doing it appropriately, there's actually a way to do it where it isn't topping, it's actually reduction. And we'll talk about making reduction cuts. So good points. Find the mouse, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about cuts. So I talked about the branch collar. So this is how we make, this is an example of how we make good cuts. So we have a good cut on the right and a poor cut on the left. So let's start with a poor cut. So in this scenario, we've got a piece of dead tissue, which we call a stub. And we want to remove that piece of dead tissue so that the tree can compartmentalize and close up around that wound, so we can avoid getting decay into the main stem. So that's one of those purposes and why we would prune a tree. And on the left-hand side, they're showing a demonstration of what we would call a flush cut, where they're actually cutting straight through that branch collar, so that kind of bulbous, bulging area around the stem. and on top of it, they're tearing the bark. So not only not only removes that tissue that's going to close up that wound, but it then makes a huge tear down the stem and is introducing even more potential for decay. So that just that one action and that one cut could, in the long run, compromise this. Whether this is a tree or just a limb, it could compromise that whole stem. We could get a significant amount of decayed wood in that limb, and it will be prone to breakage and tipping over or falling apart in the future. Now, on the right-hand side, we've got an appropriate natural target cut. And the way in which we do that to avoid tearing bark, if this is a live limb, is that we start with that spot marked A, and we make an undercut. So we're cutting underneath this branch up about halfway, and just a couple inches off of where we're going to make our final cut. Now the second cut, we jump up on top, and we go to B, and we cut just on the outside. Again, an inch, within an inch. You want to line those up pretty close. And what happens is when you make that cut on B, the weight of the limb will actually snap that hinge right there, but it'll keep any of the tissue from tearing back into that main stem. We can avoid what happened on the left-hand side. And then when I get to my final cut C, now I've got almost no weight that's sitting on this limb. So it's going to be a lot easier to make this cut and avoid that potential damage. So once we go to C, then we line up with that branch collar, and we cut just to the outside of it. Like I say, you'd rather err to be a little bit beyond and leave a little bit of a stub than to cut too far in. And every plant is a little bit different. Every tree's branch collar looks a little bit different. If you notice this, or if you've looked for this, you'll never look at a tree the same way after this. So here's just an example. This is looks like it's probably a green ash, and this cut is being, we're doing the undercut here first, just out from that branch collar, and then we skipped a step. So the undercut then made the top cut, was left with this smaller stubs, and then made the final cut, showing the branch collar. So this is what that would look like. So ash trees, branch collars are pretty apparent if you look at it. There's a lot of flare as you come down the branch. It starts to flare out, and that's where that branch collar starts. And so the final cut was made just outside. That's a nice cut. So this is where I was wanting to demonstrate what's actually happening internally. So this is a diagram from a book that is talks about the compartmentalization of decay in trees. So believe it or not, inside the tree, there's all sorts of mechanisms that happen. Anytime there's damage to the tree trunk, the tree responds in a certain way, and it has 4 different walls, different ways in which it can move, and it can stop that fungus and decay from moving throughout the tree into different areas. And so what they call it is compartmentalization. So this is demonstrating what's going on inside the tree and reasons that you would want to make that cut so that it could start to close over with new tissue. And again, here's another example of what we call a flush cut, where the collar tissue was removed. And you can see all that discoloration below it and above it, and kind of behind, as you curl behind that stem, you can see where the appropriate green colored tissue is. I think this looks like it was a type of oak if I'm looking at it closely. But you can see the amount of damage that's done on this tree by making that inappropriate cut. And internally, this is what's happening. So again, you're doing more damage. Okay, so let's get into some types of pruning. So anytime we're pruning, there's these basic 4Ds. It doesn't really matter what kind of pruning you're doing, but these are the things that we would always target. So dead tissue, any dead branches that are in the tree, anything that's diseased, we would take out. So this example here, it's an old photo, but this is a, a blue spruce, and it's got some serious cytospora canker, and that's that diseased wood that this arborist has his pole saw on that he's going to remove. So there are certain situations with um, certain plants where we want to remove that diseased material because it will actually reduce the occurrence of the disease in that tree. And cytospora is a good example of that. Anything that's damaged, so the storm that blew through that cracked that limb or broke that limb, we'll want to deal with that up there. We'll want to take out that damaged material. And then deranged. Any other reason, if there is sometimes limbs will cross over one another and maybe be missing, some critical tissue that would make it weaker. I was talking about the garbage truck that's going down the street. Not uncommon to, find damage to branches from, just being hit. So we call that deranged, and that makes the 4Ds. So let's get into some more types of cuts. So different than the cut that I was demonstrating before, and actually this gets into the question about the fruit tree pruning. There's cuts that we do that are called reduction cuts. And so a reduction cut is actually put in place when we want to reduce the length of a limb. So we'll oftentimes do this in scenarios where maybe there's a building, and instead of removing the whole limb, we're just going to bring it back from the building. You see this with power lines, actually, where trees, sometimes more aggressively than others, are taken back, but to keep our power going. But these are a type of cut that you can implement. The big reason that we typically use them as professional arborists is in young tree pruning. So I talked about structure pruning, where we don't want these limbs to be long-term for this plant. We want them to just be there temporarily until the tree gets enough height where we can remove these limbs entirely and avoid, again, I think about the tree in the boulevard between a sidewalk and a road, and there's a lot of constraints that a plant has. And if we leave these low limbs, they're going to be in the way of, pedestrians are going to be in the way of vehicles. And so we implement this method called structure pruning, where we make a planned attack to remove these limbs over time instead of just cutting them off right away, because we want to leave these limbs to again, going back to the solar panel analogy, these limbs are what's keeping, establishing this tree, keeping it alive. And so we don't want to just go and cut those things right off. So we'll take an approach where we make reductions. And so a reduction cut is, the rule of thumb is you don't want to cut back to anything less than a third of the original diameter. So what's shown in the photo is a pretty good comparison of what that might look like. In another scenario where we would use a reduction cut is if we're trying to reduce the weight of maybe a more mature tree, where we've got these big overarching limbs over a house or something like that, and there's concern that this tree is overextended and it might have too much weight and it could break off. And so we'll, instead of taking the limb entirely off, we'll implement reduction cuts, and we can go around the end of that branch and we can make cuts so that it kind of pulls it back in. It's a little maybe like bonsai, if anybody's ever done bonsai, but it's got some similar properties to that. So in these scenarios, you want to find that side limb that you're going to cut to, and you want to make the cut more or less in the angle that the branch the branch you're leaving is extending off of that stem as much as possible. So here it's, more or less parallel to that stem that's coming off. Now, one thing you need to know about making these cuts is that there is no branch collar. So when we make these cuts, the tree will have decay introduced. And so these are typically done, made as smaller cuts so that we're not introducing as much decay into the tree. So you wouldn't go up and take, an 8-inch top out of a tree and expect it to not have any impacts. That where that branch comes off, there will be decay. All right. Okay, here we go. So then the removal cut. So this is the cut making at the branch collar, which I had demonstrated. And on the left-hand side, we see this younger tree and how this cut is implemented with this tree. So in this scenario, there's plenty of space for this tree to grow out. There is no reason to take off limbs or be worried about taking off limbs like we were doing in the other. In here, they're staggering out good branch spacing on this tree. And in that case, we're actually going to be cutting all the way back to the trunk or to the parent branch. And that'll go back to a branch collar. And that's what we refer to as a removal cut. Definitely preferable to the tree in terms of the health of it. And here's another demonstration of how to make the appropriate cut. We saw the diagram on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, it's just another look at a branch collar. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on that right-hand photo, you can see this kind of blackish area right up above the branch collar, and that's a good indicator of where to look. And the cut happens just on the edge of that blacker portion on the swollen part of the branch, and that leaves that branch collar intact. So oftentimes you'll see that on many species, that indicator. All right. So pruning young trees. As I had said, probably the most critical time for tree pruning is when we've got young trees. So here's a situation. This is about as rough as it gets for a tree to be planted in a parking lot island like this, where there's no soil, nothing but asphalt and heat, no water, and it's amazing that they can grow, but they do. But we need to deal with the constraints of this plant. So we're considering, again, what is the mature height of this tree that we expect, and where do we want the branches to be when we're looking at this plant. And we need to remember, it is kind of funny, like we talk about trees, we need to remember that trees don't grow like bean plants. They extend, every single limb grows from the tip each year. It's not like it's getting pushed up from the bottom and that top is going to continue to rise up, if that makes sense. But I have had to have that conversation before, to have people really understand how plants grow. So here, this would be a good opportunity to put in place some of these reduction cuts where we're planning maybe those lowest limbs on this tree to not be here in the long run. Let's say 5 years from now, we want those trees or those branches to be completely gone. So we would institute these reduction cuts to start the process of being able to remove those limbs in the long run, but still allow them to add energy to this tree. Again, the more energy we can provide a young tree, the better off and the healthier it's going to be. So instead of cutting full limbs off, we'll do these reduction cuts in strategic locations to plan for the eventual full removal of those limbs. So it's a staggered approach. And then we'll also look for, overlapping limbs, crossing limbs. Maybe there's dead limbs. Maybe oftentimes there's broken branches, even when you get a newly planted tree, just from the delivery from the nursery. There might be broken branches, so we would remove those. Things we're looking for here in these young trees are structural concerns. So if you start to look at trees, you probably see these types of connections, these V crotches, or what we call included bark crotches. So these are abnormalities that do show up in trees very commonly, and they have a very weak attachment to the tree. So when a branch has a branch collar, that's a very strong attachment. Those limbs are, it's going to take something pretty ferocious to break those limbs off. Whereas when you have a situation like this, where we call this included bark, the tissue is growing against itself, and there's actually no live tissue behind it, which I think on the next slide I show. Yeah, which can lead to this. Oftentimes in storm situations, these are the things that we find that are broken. It's not the healthy, well-formed trees. It's these trees that have these types of defects that are going on. And some plants are more have these types of defects more commonly. Maples oftentimes can have these, and so these will be things that we would look for to remove. And in this scenario here, you could remove it all the way down to where that arrow is. The alternate approach would be to do a reduction prune and allow that tree trunk to get a little bit larger so that the cut has less of an impact on that tree. So, but we'd be looking for things like this when we're considering what to prune and what to leave and what to prune out. And again, this is how it can show up when it's more mature. I think this is a hackberry here, another tree that has this issue commonly. Got this here quick. Question in the chat is if the trees were left with these defects where they have already matured, can they still be cut, and where would you cut it? Go back to that photo here. So in this particular scenario, there's no perfect rule. I mean, these are biological, creatures that we're talking about when we talk about trees. So there is no perfect science, but in general, the larger the cut you make on a tree, the more detrimental it's going to be. So there is a point at which the damage that you're doing to the tree is so great from the standpoint of how much decay you're going to get into the tree offsets the potential risk. So dealing with a tree like this, if it weren't split and we showed up to this, talk to this homeowner about this tree, a couple of the things that we could do, one is cable it. So you'll sometimes see steel cables, and there's also what we call dynamic cables, where you could install those up in the canopy and support this tree so that in a wind event or something like that, it wouldn't be as likely to split apart. Or we could also do that with some reduction pruning. So we can actually reduce the leverage on the one side of the tree so that in a wind situation, it wouldn't be as prone to breaking. But this tree here, really like I guess the rule of thumb for me, like in taking large limbs off of trees, it's not really something you want to do super frequently, but like anything beyond 12 inches for sure, but we would 12 inches in diameter. So, uh, that's a pretty large limb to take off of any tree. And each species has a different ability to deal with that decay. Some like cottonwoods, willows would decay much more quickly, whereas maybe a bur oak or something like that would take much longer to get decay in it. But anytime you're making a cut, you have the potential to introduce decay, even if you make a good cut at the branch collar. But yeah, in this scenario, this particular tree didn't have a branch collar because it was this type of defect where the tree does not have a branch collar here to deal with this. So that's one of the reasons it's such an impact. Nancy says that she lost the center of a leader of a red oak. Now I have 2 leaders, branches in the V or the U. Both are about equal size. What should I do? Yeah, so Nancy, this would be a great scenario. So you've probably got a situation like we're looking at on this side, but it's not broken yet. But it will in the future if something's not done. So you would actually want to implement those reduction cuts like I had shown and reduce one of the sides down and allow the other one to be the main top of the tree, going back to a strong central leader. Get back to that slide today. There we go. I knew I saw that. So this is an example of a tree that has a strong, what we refer to as a central leader. So trees are strongest almost when they look like conifers. So if you can envision a spruce tree, white pine can be a bad example, but conifers oftentimes have that strong single stem with side branches coming off of it. Deciduous trees actually are strongest when they have that similar form. If you look at a tree in the woods, like a deciduous tree in the woods, you'll see that that's the form they're actually growing in. The only reason that they grow like big shrubs is because we take these trees out of the woods and we put them in the middle of a front yard where they have full access to sunlight. And what's keeping those limbs in the woods from growing is a lack of sun, because the neighbor is also looking for that sunlight, so they have no choice but to continue to grow upwards. So what we're trying to mimic in pruning these younger trees is that type of scenario where we're reducing those side limbs by making reduction cuts and trying to have the strong central leader. And you're avoiding getting big, long levers, growing off of the main stem and on this tree. Other things we look for in younger trees is just good branch spacing. So we refer to as scaffold limbs, where we've got space in between limbs, where they've got space to grow and space to thrive. So sort of preemptively, removing limbs that might eventually die because they wouldn't have enough sunlight. And so branch spacing is an important aspect when we're looking at pruning. Here's another example of the codominance, or this included bark. Like I had said, those are much weaker. Just a something that we are always looking for and always on the lookout for when we're doing pruning. And you can see that there is no branch collar. So if you think about those photos that I was showing earlier, there's no branch collar here. And so you're getting decay introduced directly into the trunk if you're making a cut here, or if it breaks off, you're getting damage to that entire side of that stem, which is really detrimental. That ultimately would probably require the tree to be removed. Now here's strong branch attachment, and you can see the collar here pretty clearly on the stem, and those those branches are really strong because of the way that they attach internally into the inside of this tree. That wood goes all the way back through that branch collar and actually ties back into the main tissue of the tree. So it's just a much stronger connection. And so we want to encourage branch attachments like this and remove or discourage those V crotches. So talking about the ratios of tissue. So I talked about, you can take up to 25%, and I've seen sometimes even more. But we're talking primarily with younger trees. If you applied that same ratio to a larger tree, you could potentially kill it, especially I'm thinking that down by you all, you're probably having some drought issues as well, but for sure in the Twin Cities Metro, we've had 2 years of straight drought. So you've got plants that are already under stress, and now on top of you compound it by taking off these, limbs and these solar panels that can stress it out even more. And there's that possibility that you could actually kill a tree. It's probably less likely that you would kill it because you took too much material off. Far more frequently is that just too many large cuts are made and the tree can't close off those wounds, and decay ultimately gets them. So it might be a longer death, but the tree just can't handle that amount of stress trying to close off those wounds, those pruning wounds. So here's an example of on the left side, we have the before, and right, the after. And what this arborist was up to was trying to, this is a young tree, and instead of just removing the entire limb, reduced it to avoid that included bark crotch that you can see is happening, but also to leave it to provide energy back to that stem because it's a young tree. Now, ultimately, in the long run, I mean, this tree looks like it's got plenty of space where those low limbs could grow, but you might choose to take that off entirely, but just not right now. So you can implement those reduction cuts in the scenario. And then here is an example of a tree that has had a couple of structure prunes. And the thing we always train homeowners and our arborists actually is that, sometimes when you implement these cuts, it can look a little bit drastic, but these trees are pretty vigorous and they'll fill in pretty quick. So, you don't have to be too concerned about making holes in the canopy. If you're looking for the right cuts to make, it's not a problem. All right, mature tree objectives, and I'm realizing, let me see where I'm at. Probably go 10 minutes longer. Is that okay? We go a little bit beyond. Let's go back here to. Okay, so let's talk more about going from young tree pruning now to mature tree. So one of the primary concerns that people have with mature trees is safety. I don't want limbs to fall off. There's dead branches, and so it's a great reason to prune mature trees. So here's an example of potential that could happen either from an ice storm or wind damage. And so we might implement certain techniques in order to minimize those things as well when we're pruning mature trees. So when we're looking at pruning mature trees, we're looking at maintaining tree health. And to do that, we implement what's called crown cleaning. So the removal of dead wood stubs and crossing branches. So it not only takes away that possibility of these dead limbs falling down on, your house, your car, somebody having a picnic, but it also allows the tree to close over those wounds by compartmentalizing it. So we'll go through and implement those different techniques. We talked about these. It's just applying the same thing to a mature tree. So just pointing out some different things that might be looked at. Trying to think if they're, one thing that people really like to do is remove water sprouts. So, these vertical sprouts or stem sprouts, they're really actually healthy for the tree. Fruit trees might be a little bit different thing where they're just growing all over the place. But if you're talking about a mature tree, the reason that they're pushing those out is oftentimes because they're lacking, the proper amount of energy coming back in. So they're actually trying to create more space to capture more energy. So if you can leave those, it's actually a good thing. So dosage, talked about this. Really less is more with mature trees. We don't want to remove too much live tissue. And it should really be justified when that does happen. There's got to be a good reason, road clearance, building clearance, broke in a storm, those kinds of things. Raise the canopy only to a maximum of 1/3 of the height of the tree. So in general, we want to have a good shoot to crown ratio, and there can be issues with wind throw and storm damage when we go beyond that. So it's a good rule of thumb is that you don't want to raise the canopy beyond 1/3 of the height of the tree. Large cuts. So I briefly touched on large cuts, but here's an example of a tree where larger cuts were made. And even if they are done at the branch collar, it's just beyond what the tree can deal with and compartmentalize. And so oftentimes you'll get these big decay pockets that are now going down inside the main trunk of the tree and ultimately are going to make the tree much weaker. Because these other branches are now attached instead of to healthy live tissue, they're attached to decaying wood. And ultimately, this tree will probably either fail in a storm or just have to be removed because it's too hazardous. So we really want to avoid larger cuts on mature trees. I think I'd given 12 inches as a reference, but that's a pretty good sized cut on a tree if you're removing limbs. Again, another good example of a collar cut. And lion's tailing. So this was an example of a poor pruning practice that I touched on, where in this tree, all of the interior branches are stripped out. So we're taking off all the branches and we're leaving these kind of, what we refer to as a lion's tail. So it's kind of this poof out at the end of each branch. And it's a technique that's sometimes implemented because people think they're going to get more sunlight down into their yards, or we're going to get more wind blowing through the tree. It actually has the reverse effect. These branches then grow longer and leggier and get more prone to wind damage. So oftentimes trees that naturally grow like this, we'll see that those are the limbs that are more likely to break off. So this is just a poor practice, and it's just indiscriminate cutting of the interior of the branches. And here's just an example of some trees that had that lion's tailing, and they were more prone to what we call wind throw. Topping. So here's an interior cut. So topping, I had said, is a bad practice. It's not something that we want to implement outside of, maybe fruit trees, things like that. But there is no collar, and you can see just all the decay where the person's hand is. That's that cross section of what happened to the stem after that cut was made. So it was just an indiscriminate cut, cutting off a branch, and now what happens is it resprouts. You can see off the left-hand side that new vegetative branching comes off, and as those grow, they're again attached to a really, weakly attached spot on the stem, and they're going to be much more likely to break off. So topping maybe temporarily, can help a tree from having storm damage in the long run. It really makes it a mess. So it's not a practice that we ever want to see. And here's just an example of a tree that got topped, and ultimately it killed this tree. And another one too. This looks like it must have been a newer one, basswood or a linden. And climbing spikes. Again, spiking and pruning, used to be much more commonplace, especially loggers. That was the only way they got up into trees. But there's no reason to, if you're going to invest in having a professional prune your tree, you certainly don't want to have them spiked. You'd be better off just leaving the tree altogether. So spikes should really only be used in situations where we're going to remove a tree. And that is the end of the presentation as I had it laid out. We covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of slides, everyone. So are there any other questions that I can answer? I have a little bit of time here. I don't have to jump right off.
How can you tell on the bark when the bark's pulling away from a tree? What's that a sign of?
Like if you see chunks of bark coming off, Connie?
Yeah.
Well, it kind of depends. I mean, it can certainly be an indicator that you have a rotten, decayed spot behind the tree, where it's actually pulling off, and it's probably trying to compartmentalize it with new tissue behind that. And there's other species where bark does just pull off. I mean, they exfoliate, and that's just what it looks like.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Nancy had said something about a lightning hit a silver maple and stripped the outer bark back on an eighth of the trunk and the base halfway up the tree. Okay, yeah, so Nancy had a scenario where it sounds like some lightning hit her tree and it broke open the stem and the bark came off, and now you can see all of the dead tissue behind it. So usually when lightning strikes, it won't kill the tree, but you will end up with these decay pockets, which are structural defects then. And so the tree is then compromised in its ability to keep. They might see is that those are going to turn into these big decay pockets, and it might tip over on its own, or you might want to consider having it removed before, if it's close to your house or close to a target or something like that. But oftentimes doesn't kill them outright. There's a chainsaw question I saw. What is your opinion on the little hand chainsaws? I'm not familiar with the little hand chainsaws. You have to tell me a little bit more about that. Or are you talking top handle? Any other questions? You know, I touched on the timing, and like I say, outside of leaf out, there's really not a bad time. Whenever your saw is sharp, as a couple of our arborists say, is the best time to prune. Certainly be cautioned as master gardeners. Be aware of the hazards of pruning as well. Like I said, power lines. Don't ever prune from ladders. I've experienced many people with injuries from doing pruning from ladders and things like that. So avoid ladders at all costs. If you are using a chainsaw, really think. I really encourage people to get the appropriate personal protective equipment if you have a chainsaw, which includes for sure Kevlar chaps, and hearing protection, eye protection, and a helmet. And honestly, I can't cut up firewood in my yard without having all of those things, just being a part of the industry for 25 years. So chainsaws are hazardous, so treat them with a lot of respect. Melody had the question, does the same pruning technique work for bushes? It really depends. If there are different types of pruning for shrubs, but you can oftentimes use these same techniques by and large. It's a good general rule without getting too far down in the weeds on different types of shrubs. But yeah, for sure. Anyone else? Connie, did I answer all your questions? Things you didn't even know?
I keep looking at my ficus 3 and think I need to do some more pruning on that, Ben.
Right. That's a good one to practice on. Your house, your trees.
Yeah, my ficus tree back here.
Nope. That is a good spot to practice.
I have a question about how do we get the recording?
Oh yeah, Lori. Nancy, do you have the answer to that?
Yes, I posted in the message in the chat.
Okay.
I do have a YouTube video channel set up, but I'm going to have to do a little bit of editing to remove the first part of this recording when people were just joining.
Oh, sure.
And I've not done that before, so it might take me a little longer to get it put up there. But once it is, I will send out the link to everybody on the email list.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
It was an excellent presentation.
Well, thanks, Lori. Appreciate it.
We're planning to share it with our grandson who is in the pruning business. He's working with a company.
Okay. Well, good. No, I mean, if you do, I mean, there's a lot of good resources out there to become a professional arborist. I took the pathway of getting introduced to arboriculture and urban forestry through the University of Minnesota, and there's a lot of good arboriculture programs out there, but the International Society of Arboriculture is the standard credentialing organization within arboriculture, and they have a certification called ISA certified. And if you're looking to hire somebody, or if you're looking to get more credentialing yourself, like your grandson, that's a great place to go get resources. And another good resource is called the Tree Care Industry Association. which focuses more on the safety aspects of arboriculture. So again, if your grandson's interested in getting more trained, that's a good place to go.
Thank you.
Yeah. The question, I have a curly willow with several trunks. It should have been trimmed last year, but now has several trunks. Is it safe to remove 2 or 3? It kind of depends on the size. Willow's extraordinarily prone to decay. So I would probably err on the side of, if you're interested in having it be one stem, this curly willow, I would put into place some of these reduction cut techniques that I had described. Pick the main central leader that you want to keep and reduce the side limbs with reduction cuts. Be my recommendation. Okay. Well, thanks for hosting this, Nancy. And Connie, thanks for the invitation. Always a pleasure to join the Grant County
Yeah.
Master Gardeners.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, you
Really,
bet.
pretty
You
nice.
bet.
Appreciate that.
All right. Well, hopefully everybody learned something here tonight, and stay warm. And I know leaf out is only 2 months away. We're closer than everybody
Yes.
thinks. Just remember, power of positive thought here. All right. Well, everybody have a good
Yeah.
evening.
Thank you. You too, Ben.
Thank you.
All right. We'll talk
Yeah,
to you
you
soon.
too.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.